Hello and welcome to the CX Files podcast. I'm your host, Mark Hillary. Cognitive Copy and Ryan Strategic Advisory recently published their 2021 Offshore BPO Confidence Index. This report analyzes outsourcing operators in 12 different countries across a number of different measures. It gives insight into the confidence on the front line in all these different markets. The two authors of the research were Matt Kendall of Cognitive Copy and my co-host on this podcast, Peter Ryan. I caught up with Matt in Barcelona and Peter in Montreal to ask about the key takeaways in this confidence index. Okay, Matt and Peter, we're talking about your Offshore BPO Confidence Index for 2021 that you've just recently published. So maybe let's start with you, Peter. I mean, what prompted the publication, the research and publication of the BPO Confidence Index this year then?
Over the course of the past, I'd say 12 months or so, there's been a lot of activity amongst the CX community, amongst the outsourcing community, to try and ascertain what locations that they need to expand into. Despite all the negative commentary and negative prognostications, offshoring and nearshoring is alive and well. And quite frankly, it's getting bigger than ever. And one of the things that became abundantly clear was, as you started to dig into what was happening in different locations, what you might be hearing from an investment promotion agency or what you might be hearing in terms of marketing spin from an outsourcer that is already in a location, it could be very different. It could have a great deal of differences relative to what you were hearing from people who were actually managing operations on the ground. And probably around maybe July, August last year, it just came to my mind that there's a real absence in the marketplace of a sounding of the views about what country managers, what individuals responsible for the operations of CX facilities are starting to feel in different key offshore and nearshore locations. So despite the fact I'd done a lot of work in individual projects trying to suss out what was really taking place on the ground in some of these different spots, I spoke to Matt and we were just kicking the idea around about wouldn't it be cool to have a formal document or a formal piece of research that actually took all these different elements into account. And that's really where the idea and the impetus was born. And what I think was really interesting was when we started thinking about the different parameters and different elements we need to include, it was pretty quickly apparent that we were going to have to take a lot of different factors into account, that we were going to have to sound the views of these different country managers on a whole series of different subjects or topics ranging from economic and political stability at the macro level all the way through down to the ability to recruit for the right profile of CX agent. And long and the short of it, the take-up has been very good. We've had a tremendous number of downloads. It's only been released about a week and a couple of days. And so far, it's the biggest downloading report I've put out since I started Ryan Strategic Advisory back in 2016. And I think Matt's had a very similar experience from the cognitive copy side.
Okay, and so Matt, can you just outline how was the research conducted? I mean, how did you put this together? Who did you interview, and how did you undertake that process?
Sure, Mark, and thanks for having me on. It's really nice to be amongst customer experience royalty today, so I appreciate you inviting me here. So how did we conduct the research? We started with a set of questions based within very specific categories. So we thought about all the things that BPOs and customer experience providers need to think about when operating in a country, or things that organizations need to think about when doing their due diligence and procuring providers in said countries. So we thought about political stability, economic stability, public security and safety, public sector trustworthiness, government support for the industry, infrastructure, commercial real estate, industry cohesiveness, so BPO associations and investment promotion agencies and support that companies get from those. And then we looked at talents. We were looking at recruitment, staffing, the possibility to scale in the locations we were looking at, the availability of language skills and previous customer experience education. So with all those categories in hand, we had to then create a series of questions that would measure respondents' confidence from a level of between 1 and 4. So 1 would be zero confidence and 4 is maximum confidence. And so the questions took maybe 15, 20 minutes to fill out. And we sent those to country managers and BPO executives within the 12 different countries that we analyzed. And we had a benchmark for kind of how many people we needed for a country to be considered worthwhile to study. So if we got a certain amount of respondents in one country, then it was included in the report. And so once all the data was collected over a couple of months, we then took all those scores. We created an average confidence rating based on, every response, and that gave us the confidence index percentages that you see within the report.
Okay, and so now that's actually just been published a few days ago, Peter, could you just outline some of the key takeaways if people go to the report now then?
So if they download the report and they can access it via Cognitive Copy or Ryan Strategic Advisory's website, what I think they're going to find in terms of the key takeaways, Mark, will be number one, they're going to get a very good sense about the locations where country managers, people running these CX operations, are feeling really good about the environment that they're sitting in. And not to put any spoilers out there, this I guess could be a spoiler alert if that expression's still used, but the top 3 locations were Colombia in first, Bulgaria in second, India in third. In each one of these locations, there is a very strong sense that across the dozen or so parameters that Matt outlined, they were feeling very good about all those different aspects. As you started to move down the different locations, it was also very clear that there were some spots that were doing really, really well in some cases. As an example, Jamaica was performing exceptionally well in terms of a political environment and the political stability, but seemed to have some challenges when it came to availability of quality commercial real estate. And you saw a number of these different elements that were factored in. Another one would be South Africa, where I think there was a tremendous amount of industry cohesiveness, and there seemed to be a great deal of confidence in terms of the quality of individuals that could be recruited to work in a BPO CX operation. But when you got into the discussion around infrastructure, they got ripped when it came to the reliability of the power supply. And this was a very, very big factor. Equally speaking, there were some tremendous concerns about the hyper-politicization of public services, whether it's the civil service, the legal system, law enforcement, et cetera. And, when we got down to the bottom end of the report, Nicaragua didn't fare so well, unfortunately. Honduras had its challenges. Poland had its challenges as well. So I think for me, the key takeaways are going to be based on what those who are actually working in these countries are feeling. You're going to have a very good sense as the reader or as an executive making the strategy for 2022 about where you can anticipate perhaps some road bumps, some obstacles, and those where it's going to be a little bit more smooth sailing.
Okay, Matt, can you just let us know then, were the results generally what you expected, or did any surprises jump out?
For the most part, Colombia being number one's certainly not much of a surprise, but looking at places like Egypt, that was a huge surprise for me because, Egypt's quite well known for its ability for companies to source languages, English, French, German, Italian, Spanish, anything you can think of, for serving European markets. So when we saw that respondents in Egypt had quite low confidence on average in their ability to source language, primarily influenced by a perception of low quality learning within public education. So that to me was a surprise. Equally, having Honduras in the number one spot for language availability was quite a surprise too. Every single respondent in Honduras said that they were absolutely confident in their ability to hire, recruit agents with suitable language skills for voice, non-voice, and digital service provision. So, that to me was the biggest surprise. But Peter, what surprises did you draw out?
Well, we've been picking up anecdotal concern for the last little while about the operating environment at the macro level in Poland. And I think when we really had this quantified concerns about political stability and economic stability, there was, for me, not so much of a surprise, but more of a validation. It's unfortunate because, as you both know, Poland was one of the top 5 locations in the 2021 Front Office Omnibus Survey, where we asked the enterprise CX decision makers their level of favorability for different offshore locations, and Poland coming in the top 5 for a second year in a row, out of 53 or so different locations. That's a great shot in the arm. But I think that there's been a lot of challenging elements of Poland in the news that we've been seeing. I think for those who are working in Poland, perhaps some of the directions that the government is taking when it comes to economic policy or political decisions is starting to have an impact in terms of how their operations are playing out. And so for me, that was probably the I don't want to say the biggest red flag, but certainly something that really stood out as a takeaway that perhaps I wasn't expecting as much.
Okay. I mean, that's some great insight then into the results and some of the surprises. But if I was a CX stakeholder and I downloaded this report, then how can I leverage this information? What is it? How is it going to help me plan for 2022? Maybe throw that back to Peter again.
Well, if I'm a CX stakeholder or an outsourcing stakeholder and I'm trying to figure out where I need to go in 2022, where do I need to expand into, I think this gives a really good sense about what an organization should be looking for in terms of a whole series of different factors that they should be considering when they're picking out a site that they want to select. The reality is that no location is going to be 100% waterproof. No location is going to be completely impermeable. And what this report will do is, I think, give almost like a sneak preview before you get on the ground about what each different location, at least a dozen that we've put in here. And certainly we hope next year we're going to be able to include more. But certainly amongst the 12 here, where are the points of strength? What are the points they need to be asking questions about when they're going to scope out a new location to an investment promotion agency or an economic development authority or members of the government? And effectively almost look how they can ascertain what are the locations that are right for them. And if there are holes, think about how they can plug them before they even get on the ground.
Thanks for downloading the CX Files podcast. If you have a moment, please give us a star rating or review on your favorite podcast provider, because this really helps other people to find the podcast. If you have any suggestions for future guests, or ideas, people, or topics, then please just find myself, Mark Hillary, or Peter Ryan on LinkedIn and send a suggestion.